December 24, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. Ludwig Krause pressed his face against the cold barbed wire fence, staring at the endless Texas horizon. The winter sun hung low, casting long shadows across the prisoner of war camp. He had been captured 11 months ago in North Africa, dragged across an ocean to a country he had been taught to hate. Everything he knew about America came from propaganda posters and whispered stories of brutality. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen on Christmas Day. This is the true story of how a simple meal shattered everything German prisoners believed about their enemy. The journey to Camp Hearn had been long and disorienting. Ludwig remembered the transport ship, packed with hundreds of captured Wehrmacht soldiers, all wondering what fate awaited them. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were barbaric. They would torture prisoners, starve them, work them to death. Otto Schneider, an older soldier who had fought in the Great War, reinforced these fears daily. "Trust nothing they say," Otto would whisper in the barracks at night. "This is all a trick. They want to break us, turn us against the fatherland." Ludwig wanted to believe Otto was wrong, but doubt gnawed at him constantly. Anton Richter, Ludwig's closest friend in the camp, saw things differently. Anton was only 19, barely old enough to shave when he had been conscripted. He had kind eyes that hadn't yet hardened from war. Anton noticed small things. The way the guards sometimes smiled. How Private Tommy Jenkins, a young American soldier barely older than Anton himself, would slip extra bread into their rations when he thought no one was looking. "Maybe they're not all bad," Anton suggested one evening as they sat in their barracks. Ludwig had scoffed at the idea. "Don't be naive. They're the enemy. This kindness is temporary. It has to be." Camp Hearn housed over 4,000 German prisoners by December 1944. The camp was organized with military precision. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the Texas landscape, surrounded by watchtowers and fences. But something was different here. The guards didn't beat them. They received 3 meals a day. There was a library, a canteen where they could buy small items, even a theater where prisoners performed plays. It was nothing like the horror stories they had been told. Still, Ludwig remained suspicious. This treatment had to be part of some larger psychological game. Sergeant Charles Anderson had seen the skepticism in the German prisoner's eyes 1,000 times. Chuck, as everyone called him, had fought in France during the First World War. He had seen the worst of humanity in those trenches. When he returned home, he promised himself that if he ever had power over enemy soldiers, he would treat them with the dignity that had been absent from that earlier conflict. Now, as a supervisor at Camp Hearn, he had that opportunity. Chuck understood that these men were soldiers, not monsters. Most had been conscripted, forced to fight for a regime they might not even believe in. The Geneva Convention provided guidelines for prisoner treatment, but Chuck went beyond the minimum requirements. He believed that showing humanity to the enemy was not weakness. It was strength. Colonel William Carter shared Chuck's philosophy. The camp commander was a tall, stern man with silver hair and a rigid posture that spoke of decades of military service. Carter had studied the failures of the Great War, how brutal treatment of prisoners had only hardened enemy resolve and prolonged conflicts. He saw Camp Hearn as an experiment in psychological warfare of a different kind. If we show them that democracy and civilization produce better treatment, better living conditions, better everything, Carter explained to his officers, we don't just contain enemy soldiers. We create ambassadors who will return to Germany after the war and tell others what they experienced. We win not just the military war, but the war of ideas. As Christmas approached, Colonel Carter made a decision that would become legendary among the prisoners. He ordered a full traditional American Christmas dinner for every prisoner in the camp. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, vegetables, fresh bread, and pumpkin pie. And perhaps most symbolically, Coca-Cola. The beverage had become an icon of American culture, a symbol of prosperity and normalcy that even reached soldiers on distant battlefields. The Coca-Cola company had worked directly with the U.S. government to ensure that American troops, and by extension, the prisoners they guarded, had access to the drink. To Carter, serving Coca-Cola to German POWs wasn't just about refreshment. It was about demonstrating American abundance, showing that even in wartime, even for prisoners, America could provide luxuries that the Third Reich could never match. When word spread through the barracks about the planned Christmas meal, reactions were mixed. Anton was excited, almost childlike in his anticipation. Real turkey, he said, eyes wide. I haven't had a proper Christmas dinner since before the war. Ludwig remained cautious. It's propaganda, he insisted. They want us to forget who we are, to make us weak. Otto Schneider was even more vocal in his opposition. This is an insult, he declared to a group of prisoners gathered in the barracks. They mock us with their excess while our families starve in Germany. Any man who enjoys this meal is a traitor to the fatherland. His words carried weight among some of the older, more ideologically committed prisoners, but many of the younger men were simply tired, hungry, and homesick. The promise of a real meal, a moment of normalcy, was too tempting to resist. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Ludwig lay in his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. He thought about his family in Hamburg. Were they safe? Had the bombing raids reached their neighborhood? His mother always made a special Christmas stew, nothing fancy, but filled with love and tradition. His younger sister would sing carols off-key, making everyone laugh. That life felt like a distant dream now, separated by an ocean and a war that seemed to have no end. Anton climbed into the bunk below, interrupting Ludwig's thoughts. Do you think the war will end soon? Anton asked quietly. Ludwig didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to say. The propaganda insisted Germany was winning, but the reality of their capture, the scale of American resources they had witnessed, suggested otherwise. Maybe, Ludwig finally replied, maybe it will end soon. Christmas morning dawned with unexpected warmth. The Texas sun broke through the winter clouds, casting golden light across the camp. The prisoners were assembled in the main yard for morning roll call. Sergeant Chuck Anderson stood before them, his breath visible in the cool air. Gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying across the assembled men. Today is Christmas. For many of you, this is a sacred day, a day of family and tradition. We understand that you are far from home, far from loved ones. But today we want to show you that even in war, even between enemies, there can be humanity. You will be served a traditional American Christmas dinner. We ask only that you receive it in the spirit it is offered. Respect and dignity. The prisoners stood in silence, processing his words. Some looked skeptical, others hopeful, a few openly emotional. The mess hall had been transformed. Red and green decorations hung from the rafters. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. Long tables were set with actual plates and utensils, not the usual tin cups and trays. The smell hit them first. Roasted turkey, rich and savory, filled the air. Ludwig felt his stomach clench with hunger. He hadn't smelled anything like that in years. The prisoners filed in, row by row, their eyes wide with disbelief. Private Tommy Jenkins stood behind the serving line, a genuine smile on his young face. Merry Christmas, he said to each prisoner as they passed, loading their plates with generous portions. Turkey, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce that gleamed like jewels, and a thick slice of pumpkin pie. And there, at the end of the line, crates of Coca-Cola, the bottles sweating with condensation, the iconic red and white labels instantly recognizable. Anton was one of the first in line. When Tommy handed him a bottle of Coca-Cola, Anton just stared at it, turning it over in his hands like it was a precious artifact. He had seen Coca-Cola in propaganda films, always portrayed as a symbol of American decadence and waste. But holding it now, feeling the cold glass, seeing the bubbles rising inside, it felt surreal. He sat down at a table and took his first sip. The sweetness exploded on his tongue, the carbonation sharp and refreshing. It was unlike anything he had tasted in years. This is real, he whispered to himself. This is actually real. Ludwig took his place in line with more reluctance. He could feel Otto Schneider's eyes on him from across the hall. Otto had refused to enter the mess hall, standing outside with a small group of loyalists, making a show of their resistance. But Ludwig's hunger overrode his political doubts. When he reached the serving line, Chuck Anderson himself was helping to serve. The sergeant met Ludwig's eyes and nodded, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Ludwig took his plate and his bottle of Coca-Cola and found a seat away from the others. He stared at the food for a long moment. In Germany, his family was likely eating whatever scraps they could find. Rationing had made every meal a challenge. And here he sat, a prisoner, being served a feast. The first bite of turkey was a revelation. It was tender, perfectly seasoned, nothing like the gray, tasteless rations they usually received. The mashed potatoes were creamy, the gravy rich. Ludwig ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to make it last. Around him, other prisoners were having similar experiences. Some ate in reverent silence. Others talked quietly, sharing memories of Christmases past. A few men openly wept, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. The Coca-Cola was its own experience. Ludwig opened his bottle and took a cautious sip. The sweetness was almost shocking after months of bland food. But more than the taste, it was what the drink represented. This was a luxury, something frivolous and unnecessary, yet they were being given it freely. It contradicted everything he had been taught about American cruelty. Private Tommy Jenkins moved through the hall, refilling drinks and checking on the prisoners. He stopped at Ludwig's table. "How is everything?" he asked in halting German. Ludwig looked up, surprised. "It's good," he replied in English, his accent thick but understandable. Tommy smiled. "My grandmother was German," he said. "She used to make the best Christmas cookies. I always wondered what it was like over there." Ludwig didn't know how to respond. This young American soldier, who should have hated him, was trying to make conversation, to find common ground. It was deeply unsettling and strangely comforting at the same time. Across the hall, Anton had made friends with several other young prisoners. They were laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. One of them, a boy named Friedrich from Bavaria, was trying to figure out how Coca-Cola was made. "It must be some kind of magic," Friedrich joked. "No one can make something taste like this with just sugar and water." They debated the secret formula, making up increasingly ridiculous theories, enjoying the simple pleasure of not thinking about the war for a few moments. Anton felt something he hadn't felt since before his capture. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. Maybe they would go home. Maybe the world wasn't as dark as it had seemed. But not everyone shared in the joy. Outside the mess hall, Otto Schneider gathered his followers. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he said, his voice harsh. "They feed you like cattle being fattened for slaughter. They want you to forget your duty, your loyalty. A true German soldier would rather starve than accept charity from the enemy." Some of the men nodded in agreement, but Otto could see doubt in their eyes. The smell of roasted turkey drifted out from the mess hall, and he knew he was losing them. Hunger and homesickness were more powerful than ideology. Otto felt a deep bitterness. The world he had known, the certainties he had clung to, were crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. Colonel Carter observed the Christmas dinner from the entrance of the mess hall. He had invited several journalists to document the event, knowing that images of well-fed, well-treated German prisoners would serve multiple purposes. It would reassure the American public that their tax dollars were being used appropriately. It would send a message to Germany that surrender didn't mean death or torture. And perhaps most importantly, it would demonstrate to the world that American values of human dignity extended even to enemies. One of the journalists, a woman from a Houston newspaper, approached Carter. "Colonel," she said, "aren't you concerned that people will think you're being too soft on the enemy?" Carter shook his head. "We're not being soft," he replied. "We're being civilized. There's a difference. These men will remember this day for the rest of their lives, and when they return to Germany, they'll carry with them a very different story than the one their government told them about America." As the meal continued, something remarkable happened. The rigid separation between prisoners and guards began to soften. Sergeant Chuck Anderson sat down at a table with several German prisoners, including Ludwig. Through a mixture of broken English and German, they began to talk. Chuck asked about their homes, their families. Ludwig found himself describing Hamburg, the harbor, the way the city looked at sunset. Chuck talked about his farm in Iowa, the endless fields of corn, the quiet peace of rural life. They discovered they had both lost brothers in the war. Chuck's brother had died at Normandy. Ludwig's brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. For a moment, the war fell away, and they were just two men sharing grief and memory. Anton approached the table hesitantly, his empty Coca-Cola bottle still in his hand. "Excuse me," he said to Chuck in careful English. "Can I ask a question?" Chuck nodded. "Why are you doing this?" Anton asked. "Why are you being kind to us? We are your enemy." Chuck was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because," he finally said, "the war won't last forever. Someday you'll go home. And when you do, I want you to remember that Americans treated you with respect. I want you to tell your children that even in the darkest times, people can choose humanity over hatred. That's how we build a better world. Not with more violence, but with more understanding. Anton felt tears prick his eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. The afternoon passed in a haze of unexpected contentment. After the meal, some prisoners were allowed to play football in the yard. Others gathered to sing Christmas carols, German and American songs mixing together in the winter air. Ludwig stood at the fence again, watching the activity, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts. Everything he had believed about America, about the war, about who was right and who was wrong, felt uncertain now. How could the enemy be evil if they fed you turkey and Coca-Cola on Christmas? How could they be monsters if they treated you better than your own officers sometimes had? These questions had no easy answers. Otto Schneider approached Ludwig at the fence. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "You ate their food," Otto said. It wasn't a question. Ludwig nodded. "I was hungry." Otto spat on the ground. "You're weak. All of you. When we return to Germany, you'll answer for this betrayal." Ludwig turned to face Otto fully. "It's not betrayal to accept food, it's survival. We lost, Otto. We were captured. Clinging to propaganda won't change that." Otto's face reddened with anger. "We haven't lost. Germany will rise again. The Führer will—" Ludwig cut him off. "The Führer isn't here. He isn't starving in a prison camp. He isn't wondering if his family is alive. We are. And today, these Americans gave us something we haven't had in a long time. They gave us dignity." Otto stared at Ludwig for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere was different. Men talked quietly about the day, about what it meant. Some, like Otto, retreated into angry silence. But many, especially the younger prisoners, felt something shift inside them. Anton lay in his bunk, his stomach full for the first time in months, and thought about home. He thought about his mother's face, his father's stern but loving discipline, his little sister's laugh. He thought about the farm where he had grown up, the simple rhythms of planting and harvest. Before the war, before the propaganda, before the hatred, life had been simpler. Maybe it could be simple again. Maybe when this was all over, people would remember how to be human to each other. Ludwig couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the Coca-Cola bottle. Such a small thing, but somehow it represented everything. In Germany, resources were scarce. Every scrap of metal, every drop of fuel was dedicated to the war effort. But here, America had so much abundance that they could give luxury items to prisoners. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about values. The Americans believed that even prisoners deserved small comforts, small dignities. Ludwig had been raised to believe that strength came from hardness, from the ability to endure suffering without complaint. But maybe, he thought, maybe real strength came from choosing kindness even when you didn't have to. Maybe that was what made a civilization truly great. The days after Christmas brought a subtle but noticeable change in the camp. The walls between prisoners and guards continued to lower. More conversations happened. More shared humanity emerged. Private Tommy Jenkins started teaching English classes to interested prisoners. Anton was one of his most eager students. Chuck Anderson organized a chess tournament, prisoners versus guards, with small prizes for the winners. Even Colonel Carter seemed more relaxed, pleased with the success of his Christmas experiment. The journalists' articles had been published, and the response was largely positive. Americans liked knowing that their country took the moral high ground even in war. But the war itself continued. News filtered into the camp of battles in Europe, of Germany's slow but steady retreat. The prisoners heard about the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive and its eventual failure. Each piece of news brought mixed emotions. Hope that the war might end soon, fear about what would happen to Germany, worry about families caught in the crossfire. Ludwig noticed that even Otto Schneider seemed less certain now. The old soldier still maintained his rigid loyalty, but there was a weariness in his eyes, a recognition that the world he had known was ending. In February 1945, Anton received a letter from home. It had been months in transit, passed through multiple censors, but it finally reached him. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter was from his mother. She wrote about the difficulties at home, the food shortages, the constant fear of air raids, but she also wrote about hope. She was glad he was safe, glad he was being treated well. She had heard rumors about American prison camps, about how prisoners were fed and clothed and treated humanely. "Pray for peace," she wrote. "Pray that this madness ends soon and you can come home." Anton read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word. He showed it to Ludwig, who read it silently, feeling the weight of a mother's love and fear in every sentence. March brought warmer weather and more news of Allied advances. The prisoners knew the end was near. Germany was collapsing. The question was no longer if they would lose, but when and what would happen afterward. Ludwig found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't before. He had been a carpenter before the war, building houses and furniture. Could he return to that life? Would there even be houses left to build in Hamburg? The uncertainty was terrifying, but also strangely liberating. For years, his life had been dictated by others. The military, the government, the war. Maybe, when it was over, he could make his own choices again. On April 12, 1945, news reached the camp that President Franklin Roosevelt had died. The American guards were visibly shaken, grieving for their commander-in-chief. Ludwig was surprised to find that he felt sympathy for them. Chuck Anderson, usually so composed, sat on a bench outside the barracks with his head in his hands. Ludwig approached cautiously. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. Chuck looked up, his eyes red. "Thank you," he replied. He was a good man. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Ludwig nodded. "That's a rare quality." They sat together in silence, 2 soldiers from opposite sides, sharing a moment of grief for a leader who had shaped the world they lived in. May brought the news everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When the announcement was made in the camp, reactions ranged from relief to despair. Anton felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "It's over," he kept saying. "It's finally over." Ludwig felt more conflicted. Yes, the war was over, but Germany had been utterly defeated. What would that mean for his country, for his family, for his future? Otto Schneider retreated to his bunk and didn't speak for days. The world he had believed in had collapsed completely. Everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed had been for nothing. The process of repatriation began slowly. The prisoners would not be sent home immediately. There were millions of displaced people across Europe, and organizing their return was a massive logistical challenge. But knowing that home was a possibility, not just a dream, changed everything. The prisoners began to think about rebuilding, about creating new lives from the rubble of the old. Ludwig started drawing plans for houses, simple designs that could be built quickly and cheaply. Anton talked about returning to his family's farm, about planting crops and raising animals and living a quiet life far from politics and war. In June, Sergeant Chuck Anderson gathered a group of prisoners, including Ludwig and Anton, for a final conversation. "You'll be going home soon," he said. "I want you to remember something. What you experienced here, the way you were treated, that's not propaganda. That's not a trick. That's what we believe in. Human dignity, fairness, the rule of law. When you go back to Germany, you'll have a choice. You can hold on to bitterness and hatred, or you can help build something better. I hope you choose the latter." Ludwig extended his hand, and Chuck shook it firmly. "Thank you," Ludwig said, "for everything. For showing us that even enemies can be human." Chuck smiled. "You were never really my enemy. You were just a man on the wrong side of a bad war." The day came for Ludwig and Anton to leave Camp Herne. They packed their few belongings, said goodbye to the guards who had become, against all odds, something like friends. Private Tommy Jenkins gave Anton a final English lesson, writing down phrases that might be useful. Otto Schneider left without a word, his face still hard and unforgiving, unwilling to acknowledge the humanity he had witnessed. But most of the prisoners left with changed perspectives, carrying stories of Christmas turkey and Coca-Cola, of American guards who treated them with respect, of a country that had shown them mercy when it could have shown cruelty. The journey back to Germany was long and difficult. Europe was in ruins. Cities had been bombed into rubble. Millions were dead or displaced. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. When Ludwig finally reached Hamburg, he barely recognized it. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled. His family's apartment building was still standing miraculously, and he found his mother and sister alive, thin and exhausted, but alive. They held each other and wept. too overwhelmed for words. That night, as they shared a meager dinner of bread and weak soup, his mother asked about his time as a prisoner. Ludwig told her about Camp Herne, about the Christmas dinner, about the guards who had treated him like a human being. She listened, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God there was still kindness in the world." Anton returned to his family's farm in Bavaria. The land had been neglected during the war, but it was still there, still fertile, still full of possibility. His father had survived, and together they began the slow work of rebuilding. As Anton plowed the fields, he thought about Private Tommy Jenkins, about the English lessons, about the simple act of sharing a Coca-Cola on Christmas Day. Those small gestures of humanity had given him hope when hope seemed impossible. He promised himself that he would pass that lesson on to his children someday. He would teach them that even in the darkest times people have a choice. They can choose hatred, or they can choose understanding. And that choice makes all the difference. Years later, Ludwig became a successful carpenter, helping to rebuild Hamburg from the ruins. He married, had children, and lived a long, quiet life. But he never forgot Christmas Day, 1944, in a prison camp in Texas. He told the story to his children, and they told it to theirs. The story of how a simple meal, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and the kindness of strangers had changed everything he believed about the world. It became a family legend, a reminder that humanity can survive even the worst circumstances, that enemies can become friends, and that sometimes the smallest gestures have the greatest impact. Anton also lived a long life, never leaving his farm in Bavaria. He became known in his community as a man of deep wisdom and compassion. When asked about his time in the war, he would always talk about Camp Herne, about the Americans who had shown him that the world was bigger and more complex than propaganda suggested. He taught English to local children, passing on the lessons Tommy Jenkins had given him. And every Christmas he would raise a glass of Coca-Cola, a tradition that puzzled his neighbors but meant everything to him. It was his way of remembering, of honoring the humanity that had been shown to him when he needed it most. The story of Camp Herne and the Christmas dinner of 1944 became part of the historical record, documented in letters, photographs, and official reports. It stood as a testament to the idea that even in war, even between enemies, there can be moments of grace. The German POWs who experienced that day carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, and many became advocates for peace and reconciliation in the post-war years. They had learned in the most unexpected way that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies. The legacy of that Christmas dinner extended far beyond the individuals involved. It became a symbol of the values that would shape the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Europe, was rooted in the same philosophy that Colonel Carter had applied at Camp Herne, the idea that showing generosity and humanity, even to former enemies, was not weakness but strategic wisdom. That building bridges was more effective than building walls. The prisoners who returned to Germany carried these lessons with them, and they helped create a new Germany, one built on democracy and human rights rather than authoritarianism and hatred. Sergeant Chuck Anderson returned to his farm in Iowa after the war. He rarely talked about his time at Camp Herne, but those who knew him understood that it had been one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. He had proven to himself that the horrors he witnessed in the First World War didn't have to be repeated, that there was another way to treat the enemy. He lived quietly, farming his land, raising his family, and believing until the end of his days that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed futile. Colonel William Carter went on to have a distinguished military career, eventually retiring as a general. But when asked about his greatest achievement, he always mentioned Camp Herne and the Christmas dinner. He believed that those small acts of humanity had done more to win the peace than any battle could have done. He wrote extensively about prisoner treatment and the importance of maintaining moral standards even in wartime. His writings influenced military policy for generations, shaping how democratic nations would treat prisoners in future conflicts. Private Tommy Jenkins returned home to his family in Ohio, where he worked as a teacher for 40 years. He taught history and German, always emphasizing the importance of understanding other cultures and perspectives. He stayed in touch with several of the German prisoners he had befriended, exchanging letters for decades. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, he wept with joy, seeing it as the final victory of the values he had witnessed at Camp Herne. The idea that human connection was stronger than political division, that kindness could triumph over hatred. Otto Schneider returned to Germany a broken man. He never reconciled with what had happened, never accepted that the ideology he had devoted his life to was fundamentally wrong. He lived in bitterness and isolation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to change, of clinging to hatred even when shown an alternative. His story reminds us that not everyone can be reached, that some people are too damaged by propaganda and ideology to accept truth, but his was the exception, not the rule. Most of the prisoners who experienced that Christmas dinner were changed by it, opened to new possibilities and new ways of thinking. The Coca-Cola company, perhaps unintentionally, became a symbol of American soft power. The image of German prisoners drinking Coca-Cola on Christmas Day was used in marketing for decades, though the company was always careful to frame it as a story of shared humanity rather than triumphalism. The drink itself became a global phenomenon in the post-war years, spreading American culture and values around the world. For better or worse, that bottle of Coca-Cola represented something larger than itself. It represented abundance, optimism, and the American belief that even small pleasures mattered, even in difficult times. The turkey dinner, rooted in American tradition going back to the 19th century, was another powerful symbol. Food has always been a language of love and care, and serving a traditional holiday meal to prisoners was a way of saying, "You are not forgotten. You are not less than human. You deserve dignity and comfort." That message resonated deeply with men who had been taught that they were expendable, that their lives mattered only in service to the state. The simple act of being fed well, of being given a meal prepared with care, challenged everything they had been told about their worth and about their enemy. Camp Hearn itself continued to operate until 1946, when the last prisoners were repatriated. The camp was then dismantled, the buildings torn down, the land returned to its original use. But the memory of what happened there lived on. In 2011, a museum was established to commemorate the camp and tell the stories of the prisoners and guards who had lived there. Visitors can see photographs of the Christmas dinner, read letters written by prisoners, and learn about this remarkable chapter of World War II history. The museum serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine through. The story of Christmas Day at Camp Hearn challenges our simple narratives about war. We want to believe in clear heroes and villains, in good versus evil, but the reality is always more complex. The German prisoners were not monsters. They were men, many of them conscripted against their will, fighting for a cause they might not have believed in. The American guards were not saints. They were doing their jobs, following orders, trying to maintain order in difficult circumstances, but both groups chose in that moment to see each other as human beings. And that choice made all the difference. This story also reminds us of the power of cultural symbols. A bottle of Coca-Cola, a roasted turkey, a Christmas carol. These things might seem trivial, especially compared to the grand sweep of history and war, but to the individuals involved they were profound. They represented normalcy, tradition, connection to home and family. They were reminders that life existed beyond the war, that there was still beauty and joy in the world. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest meaning. Sometimes a simple meal can change everything. The legacy of Camp Hearn continues to this day. It reminds us that how we treat our enemies defines us more than how we treat our friends. It challenges us to find humanity even in those we disagree with, even in those who have hurt us. It suggests that mercy is not weakness but strength, that extending dignity to others doesn't diminish us but elevates us. These lessons are as relevant today as they were in 1944. In a world still torn by conflict and division, the story of Christmas Day at Camp Hearn offers a different path, a reminder that we always have a choice in how we respond to others. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on this remarkable Christmas dinner and what it means to you. And hit the like button to help us share these important lessons with more people. History has so much to teach us, but only if we're willing to listen. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail.